Congressman Auchincloss, thank you so much for being here on the eve of an important NATO summit. A lot going on behind the scenes in terms of the fight over the language, whether Ukraine will get a bridge to NATO, whether they'll get an undeniable path. You see fights between the United States and Germany on one side, the Nordic countries on other sides. What are you hoping that the Ukrainians will get out of this summit in particular?
Good morning. Thanks for having me here. I don't think we should irretrievably commit to NATO membership for Ukraine. I'm a very strong supporter of Ukraine, have been from the beginning, will continue to be all the way through victory. But I believe Ukraine's security and economic future ultimately is vested in the European Union. People forget this, but the European Union actually has a very strong set of collective defense articles as well, Lisbon's 42.7. And that language legally is just as tight as Article 5, but politically it's been interpreted as looser. And my argument is that the European Union, in addition to investing in its own defense industrial complex, should be investing in its own political collective will, so that when Ukraine joins the European Union, as I believe it should and as I believe it wants to, they also have security guarantees.
So is there a risk of going too far in the NATO Article 5 direction, or do you think just the EU security guarantees are airtight enough to basically give them a similar guarantee?
Well, the EU security guarantees are as airtight as the EU decides to make them. I mean, Article 5 didn't become the most effective collective defense article in history because it was written down that way. It became that way because we stood by it and because we honored it. And so the strength of 42.7 will be in the manifestation of it over the course of the next generation. And that's the challenge for the European Union going forward. I think our focus right now should be less on legal verbiage for NATO and more on authorizing Ukraine to strike anytime, anywhere inside Russia with any weapon so that they can disrupt not just troop staging sites and the industrial base of their war machine, but most importantly, their energy infrastructure.
Well, yeah, wanted to ask you about that as well, because we just got off stage with Chairman McCall, who's a supporter across the aisle of Ukrainian strikes on Russian soil using American weapons. What do you think the Ukrainians can realistically achieve with greater targeting authority? Because we haven't seen the gains on the battlefield in 2023 and 2024 that perhaps we were expecting, that perhaps the American people would have led to greater support back domestically.
Multiple things. So probably most tactically obvious is, one of the first things you learn in Marine officer training is you want to stage your troops outside of the radius of your enemy's weapon systems. And that's what the Russians are doing. They're not dumb. And so they're staging their troops on the other side of the border outside of Ukrainian weapon system ranges. That tactical advantage would be obviated by allowing Ukraine to strike them, not just near Kharkiv, but everywhere. The second one, and I think this is the most important, is energy. I mean, it's very complicated, and yet it's kind of very simple. Energy is fueling the Russian war machine, and we got to do two things in complementarity. One is strike those oil and gas fields. Very expensive to repair those things, very time-consuming to get them up and running again. We've got to tighten sanctions, number two, on the critical inputs that they need to repair those oil and gas fields. And then number three is tighten the maritime insurance sanctions that Treasury has been advocating for so that they can't use a shadow fleet to try to sell their oil overseas at above the price cap. We do those three things, and we're going to start to suffocate their revenue that they need to wage this war.
Obviously, the administration has been reluctant to expand the targeting authority beyond a certain window, just fears of escalation. I'm curious if you think those hold water. And after sort of this 6-month fight that Congress just had about the supplemental, where do you see political will for supporting the Ukrainians into the future?
I believe a majority of Congress would support authorizing Ukraine to strike anywhere, any place, anywhere, anytime, inside Russia. And Chairman McCall and I actually had an amendment to that effect that unfortunately didn't make it into the NDAA. I know right now there's an intramural debate in the administration between Treasury and the White House over the maritime insurance sanctions. I would like to see the administration move aggressively on both the maritime insurance sanctions and the authority to strike Russian energy infrastructure. I believe they would have Congress's support to do both those things.
But it sounds like you think the administration hasn't been aggressive enough on both sides, on the military and the economic side.
Yeah, I think President Biden in the last 2 years has been enormously effective in rallying and maintaining Western unity, not just Western, but Western plus East Asian unity in support of Ukraine. I think at this point, I would have them calibrate a little bit more aggressively. I think they are overly indexing to a theory of risk about Putin's threat mongering to NATO territory and under-indexing to the risk of first Kiev and then what? Because that, to me, is the true dimension of escalation that we have to be worried about.
I wanted to turn to the Indo-Pacific a little bit because obviously you're a member of the China Select Committee in the House. We've seen the last two NATO summits, actually really the last several NATO summits, begin to drum up the alliance's support for dealing with the Indo-Pacific. I'm curious what you think NATO's role should be on China and how they should be responding to China's role in Ukraine.
So what's not helpful is when Germany's chancellor goes to China and basically speaks to the interests of a couple of German automakers and not to the interests of NATO, of the European Union, of the Transatlantic Alliance. We need the Europeans to understand that China is going to run the same playbook over and over again when it comes to economics. It's going to do joint ventures to intake knowledge and know-how. It's going to then scale up domestically their ability to produce those same products and services, and then it's going to dump those products on global markets and drive competitors out of business. And we've got to stop fighting for table scraps against this tactics, and we have to collectively de-risk from China and at the same time engage with more trade and investment ties with the global South. And I'd like to see Europe and the United States work in partnership on that front.
The Secretary General has hinted on NATO nations even going as far as potentially sanctions for the material support that we've seen the Chinese provide to the Russians. Do you think that's a step that NATO nations should be taking?
Yeah, I mean, China is equipping Russia's war machine with imports of Russian oil, but probably even more importantly, exports of dual-use technologies. And there needs to be the imposition of sanctions against their financial sector and against their export sector for their role in that. Where I would caution NATO to, I think, not overreach, though, is into trying to take its template of collective defense and apply it to the Indo-Pacific. I think Indo-Pacific security should be architected around Japan, South Korea, Australia, India. We've got our own set of alliances, our own set of security architecture in the Indo-Pacific that I think needs to be organic to the China threat.
Well, I mean, that's an interesting question as well, too, as we're looking at these more ambitious NATO war plans, and I posed a similar question to Chairman McCall, but you're looking at NATO war plans that are very, very reliant on American troops, American enablers, all sorts of American capabilities. I know you've been at the Select Committee wargaming all the different contingencies that the U.S. could face in the Indo-Pacific. I mean, are these war plans executable if all of those enablers, all those troops end up in the Indo-Pacific?
Yeah, I don't think I buy that it's a zero-sum enterprise here. The story of the 20th century and 21st century has been there is tremendous latent industrial productivity in the West, and when it's tapped into, it can tip the balance of war. And I think that's the same would be the case in both the Indo-Pacific and in Europe. Where I would ask NATO to focus in terms of its investments is in the Eastern European sector, where you've got Estonia, Poland, Lithuania, Ukraine, all of whom are Finland, Sweden, all of whom are anxious to work together on creating sort of an Eastern Bloc defense industrial complex that can become self-sustaining in its own armaments, its own troops, its own technologies, particularly if it's invested through the frozen Russian assets. So I actually have a lot of confidence. I'm bullish on NATO's defense industrial complex in the next decade.
That's interesting because we've seen, of course, NATO not hit its artillery targets for Ukraine that it wanted to hit last year. It seems to be behind the curve this year. Obviously, the American industrial production still scaling up on 155 and other artillery capabilities the Ukrainians would need, also that NATO would need. I'm curious, why do you think that industrial capability is latent? Why is it sort of late to the game here?
Because there's always a guns and butter trade-off, and since the fall of the Berlin Wall, Western populations have wanted to go more towards butter and away from guns, and I think that realization is changing. I've interacted with a huge cross-section of European ambassadors over the last year, and the message is always the same, which is their populations take this incredibly seriously. This is not sort of academic. This is near and personal, and I think we're going to see sustained political will, and where there's political will, there will be the industrial investments.
It's interesting, too, on the eve of the summit, of course, we see allies spending more, 23 out of 32 allies now at the 2% mark. I'm curious, sort of in the midst of this election season where we see former President Trump very openly skeptical of NATO, skeptical of allies' commitments, how should the U.S. be preparing for a second Trump administration? How are you preparing in Congress? And I mean, can NATO sort of survive a Trump 2.0 with the confidence that he's
Well, how I'm preparing is I'm trying to prevent it. I think a second Trump administration would be a disaster. We got a guy here who was out-negotiated by the Taliban, according to his own defense secretary, and now he's saying he's going to end the Russia-Ukraine war before he takes office in January 2025. I mean, it would be comical if it were not tragic, and it's absolutely a threat to our ability to defend democracy globally. I think the thing that sometimes gets overlooked, though, by our allies and partners is that Congress is the ballast in the ship of state. And if you can maintain 2/3 of the support of Congress in terms of an overarching foreign policy, even reckless presidents have a hard time, I think, running against the grain on that. And Taiwan's a great example. Taiwan Relations Act, that was congressionally driven. And for a long, long time, Congress was, I think, more hawkish on Taiwan than any president, Democratic or Republican, was. That's starting to change now, of course, in the last couple of administrations. But the same can be true for a whole series of dimensions of U.S. foreign policy. You get 2/3 of Congress in the right place on it, and the ship is steadied.
So you think that 2/3 is holding? I mean, are people making too much as sort of factions on the far right and factions on the far left within Congress that are less supportive of NATO, maybe less supportive of U.S. engagement in the world?
No, that's exactly the right follow-up, is then, okay, well then what about Congress? And I heard the chairman before say he thought that the Republican Party was actually more pro-Ukraine. I got great respect for Mike. I think he's one of the good ones on the other side of the aisle. I'm watching the vote board. I'm not seeing it. A majority of the Republican caucus is going back to a America First isolationism. And this is not a new thing. I think many people in the audience can appreciate that in America's 250-year history, isolationism has been not just a thread, but maybe the dominant thread of American foreign policy, right? This idea of international engagement is relatively new in U.S. foreign policy, really since World War II. And you've got a MAGA wing of the Republican Party that is firmly entrenched in that old school mindset. I think that those ranks are growing, and I am very worried about the 2/3.
I'm curious, sort of, if these plans sort of go ahead, if you see sort of NATO upgrade its war plans as it's attempting to do, you see continued support for the Ukrainians. I guess what is your best case scenario? Sort of, what's the theory of victory here? I mean, can the Ukrainians take back their territory? Or are you looking at a negotiated settlement? And sort of, how do you see the Russians being deterred more in a long term?
I think there are 3 parameters for a Ukrainian victory, and I strongly believe that Ukraine will be victorious. One is freedom of navigation in the Black Sea. That's their economic and industrial lifeline for the viability of their economy. Number 2 is a secure eastern border, obviously. And then number 3 is accession to the European Union, which is really the intent of the Ukrainian people and what started Russia's belligerence in 2014. If those 3 things are true, if Ukraine is in the European Union or getting into the European Union with the Lisbon Treaty providing security, if they have a secure eastern border through security guarantees and through its own industrial and military readiness, and if they have freedom of navigation in the Black Sea, I call that a W.
I'm curious, we have about a minute and a half left. What are you looking for in particular at this NATO summit? Or are you taking any meetings you're excited about? Or, I mean, are you looking for, you said you don't expect Ukraine to get a path to NATO. That's not necessarily sort of the best step. I'm curious, what you see out of the summit, potentially taking place, sort of some key benchmarks for the allies to be hitting here.
I would like much more aggressive statement about authorities to strike Russian territory, particularly energy infrastructure. And I'd like, understanding that it's really outside of NATO's remit, it's more G7, but I would like indication towards tightening maritime insurance sanctions. Really, I want the focus to be on Russia's energy infrastructure and how over the next 12 months there is a credible plan in place to cripple their ability to use energy to sustain their war effort.
Do you think the allies are on track for that?
I don't know.
It'll be interesting to see. Well, Congressman, appreciate the time. Thank you so much for being here.
Good to be with you.